Hello. Today I speak of narratology and its possible future. As I've already mentioned, from the beginning and even before the beginning, the history of narratology and its prehistory has been marked by controversies, disputes, and transformations. Many practitioners of narratology disagree about the very nature of their domain, and this situation of disagreement is increasingly exemplified through distinctions between so-called classical and so-called post-classical narratology. In what is considered its classical phase, narratology is a scientifically motivated, structuralist-inspired study of narrative, which examines what all and only possible narratives have in common, as well as what allows them to differ narratively from one another. Classical narratology refers back to Saussurean linguistics through its interest in narrative langue rather than narrative parole, through its interest in what enables a narrative to mean rather than what that narrative means. Particularly successful in the 1960s and 70s, classical narratology includes among its most celebrated representatives the French or Francophonic founding fathers, Roland Barthes, Tsvetan Todorov, Gérard Genette, R.J. Dumas, and Claude Braillon. Classical narratology distinguishes between Gehalt and Gestalt, matter and manner, or, as the Danish linguist Jensler would say, substance and form. It locates the specificity of narrative in the form of narrative content and narrative expression. It argues that differences in form account for distinctly narrative differences between narrative texts. It considers the set of all and only narratives constituting its domain in a synchronic instead of a diachronic way, and it concentrates on questions of technique and poiesis, making, composition, craft, rather than on authorial intentions, receiver reactions, contextual situations, and functions. Besides, it is also formalist in its view that the infinite diversity of narrative forms results from different combinations of a finite set of invariant elements, as well as it is formalist in its commitment to the elaboration of a formal system describing these elements and their possible combinations. As a matter of fact, classical narratology has proposed a number of narrative grammars about which I am thinking of the ones that I myself devised, about which some people say that they were like mountains giving birth to molehill. Post-classical narratology, which does not have much of a French accent, and which begins to make a mark as early as the 1980s, even if the name post-classical narratology is first used in an article by David Herman, who was a student of mine, an article in 1997. Post-classical narratology presents a relatively different profile. As the name suggests, Post-classical narratology does not represent a negation or rejection of classical narratology, but rather a prolongation, an extension, an expansion, a refinement of it. Post-classical narratology includes classical narratology as one of its decisive stages or components. It rethinks and recontextualizes it. It exposes its limits but exploits its possibilities. It retains its bases, re-evaluates its scope, and constitutes a new version of it. Post-classical narratology asks the questions that classical narratology asks. For example, what is narrative? Or what is a narrative as opposed to non-narrative or a non-narrative? What are the possible kinds of narrative? What increases or decreases narrativity? But post-classical narratology also asks other questions on the interaction between narrative structure, semiotic form, and vision of the world or reality, on the function and not merely the functioning of reality, on what this or that narrative means, and not only on how all and only narratives mean, on narrative as process or production, on narrative dynamics, if you will, on narrative progressions and their consequences, and not simply narrative as product, on the influence of context and means of expression, on the history of narrative as much as the system underlying it, on narratives in their diachrony as much as in their synchrony, and so on and so forth. It even seems that, for its most fervent champions, no question, nothing in narrative texts or their indefinitely many contexts, nothing is alien to post-classical narratologies, and the very term is more or less equivalent to narrative studies. Some of the distinctions made between classical and post-classical narratology are perhaps not very significant or very convincing. It is said, for instance, that post-classical narratology involves many more instruments than classical narratology. It involves not just Saussurean linguistics, but computational linguistics, conversational analysis, sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics. And not only linguistics and its different inflections, but all the resources provided by the textual, communicational, and cognitive sciences. However, classical narratology too borrowed from numerous and diverse domains. It borrowed from generative linguistics, deep structure, surface structure, transformations, from optics, focus and focalization, from topology, homotopic and heterotopic, from the visual arts and the cybernetic sciences, the notion of frame and framing, from game theory, the notion of moves, and even from sexology, the notion of climax. Similarly, though it is true that post-classical narratology may not be formalist and may not believe that the form of a narrative work accounts for that work's narrative specificity, it is also true that post-classical narratology is very much interested still in form and in the investigation of form. But certain differences are undeniably more important, in particular with regard to the range of questions asked. If classical narratology, even when it acknowledges its significance, neglects the context, by at least temporarily bracketing it, at least temporarily and artificially restricting it, or making it part of the text and therefore unintentionally drowning it. Post-classical narratology, even as it recognizes the importance of the text, can drown it by making it simply part of the context. Classical narratology tried to concentrate on narratively specific questions. Post-classical narratology is eager to study narrative, as I said yesterday, I quote, in relation to a referential context that is simultaneously linguistic, literary, historical, biographical, social, political, and much, much more. Given a fictional text like John became European champion and then world champion, for example, one can ask how many events does this text represent? This is a classical question. And one can also ask why it speaks of John instead of Juan, of Daniel, of Mary, of Jane. This is a post-classical question. Still, whether the differences between classical and post-classical narratology are significant or not, whether one regards the former as part of the latter or as distinct from it, and whether one prefers to wear classical or post-classical glasses, and one prefers to favor formalist, feminist, rhetorical, or post-colonial approaches when studying narrative, there are a number of tasks that sketch at least part of the future for narratology, and that classical and post-classical narratologists alike may well persevere in doing or may well undertake. Among the tasks that are both well-established and never-ending, perhaps the most evident one consists in assessing and setting forth consensual views about the nature of narrative, consensual answers to such questions as what are the constitutive traits or some of the constitutive traits of all narratives. We know, for instance, that conceptions of the narrative object vary. Today, like yesterday, and like on Tuesday, today I will adopt the following definition. An object is a narrative if and only if it is taken to be the logically consistent representation of at least two related asynchronous events or one state of affairs in one event that do not presuppose or imply each other. And I will add again that in spite of undeniable divergences, there are also indisputable convergences among narratologists regarding the nature of narrative. Not only do they agree in viewing narratives as representations of events, but they further agree that these narrative representations can be expanded or summarized, that they can be combined with other narrative representations through specifiable ways like conjunction, embedding, or alternation, and that they can be extracted from larger narrative representations. Another important and perennial task consists in reviewing, with the help of old classes and instruments or new ones, and through the exploration of traditional or novel corpora, characteristic narratological features and categories. Narratology which endeavors to account not only for narrative commonality but also for narrative diversity, has often constituted the toolkit for criticism by providing a large number of questions to ask of any narrative, a large number of descriptive tools with which to capture its specificity and found or support certain interpretive conclusions about it. As a long tradition of criticism centered on narrative technique demonstrates, any narratologically descriptive statement can become a springboard for a reading. Any technical feature can lead to the construction of meaning. Any how can give rise to a why. Conversely, narratological investigations of specific works test the validity and the rigor of narratological categories, distinctions, and arguments. They identify more or less significant elements that narratologists may have overlooked, underestimated, overestimated, or misunderstood, and they can lead to basic reformulations of models of narrative. Such textual engagement, particularly with so-called unnatural, that is, non-traditional narratives, such textual engagement has indeed uncovered extravagant framings, quaint focalizations, erratic chronologies, weird temporalities, bizarre modalities. More generally, the revisiting of narratological concepts and devices has multiplied, diversified, fortified, and refined them. In the area of narratological or narratorial mediation or lack thereof, for example, one can point to immediate or free direct discourses issuing from a single individual, but also, as I pointed out yesterday, from a more or less heterogeneous group or collectivity, from a plurivocal we instead of a monovocal I. One can also point to free indirect discourses that are multi-voiced as opposed to merely dual-voiced, and mix several language situations rather than only two. In the area of temporality, one can distinguish, along with chronisms, one can distinguish perichronisms, which I would like to briefly consider in a minute. If they do not directly imply chronological relations at the level of the narrated and the narrating, or temporal connections between the two, perichronisms correspond in the narrative domain to a spectral or modal features insofar as these features relate to temporality. Indeed, narrative situations and events can be considered and characterized not only from the point of view of their date or their duration, but also from the point of view of their own development, of their unfolding, of their way of manifesting themselves in that duration and at that date. They can be approached from the inside or the outside, at their beginning or their end, in their completion or their progression, and they can bear the marks of backgrounding or foregrounding, the attenuative or the intensive, the telic, the iterative, the moderative, and so on. Moreover, these situations and events can be real or virtual, necessary or not, under the sign of the negative or the interrogative, the imperative, the exclamative, the wishful, and so forth. No doubt, the links between these spectral or modal values and temporality are not always apparent, but but tenses, aspects, and moods often intersect. Canonical narrative, aside from the fact that it progresses by alternating the global and the punctual, background and foreground, as well as scene and summary, canonical narrative narrates and disnarrates, reporting not only what happened, but what did not happen or what could have happened, and often incorporating and detailing the scripts that characters fear or desire, expect or delay, imagine or deconstruct. Besides, programmatic narratives, instructions, recipes, procedures abound. Private diaries, as well as serials or some news stories, are to a great extent molded by what is to take place or may take place. The perpetual beginnings longed for by André Gide in The Counterfeiters, as well as the passé composé, the present perfects of Albert Camus in The Stranger, have given birth to literally thousands of pages of commentary. And in the past 50 years or so, numerous writers have exploited aspectually and modally unusual narrative possibilities. Conditional narration in Georges Perec's The Things, systematically subjunctive presentation in Jean-Michel Reynaud's Pour un Perec les traits chiffrés, for a letter and numbered Perec, directives in Larry Moore's Self-Help, hesitant reporting in so many nouveau romans and postmodernist novels. More generally, various narrative elements, origins and destinations, continuities and discontinuities, foreshadowing, side-shadowing, and back-shadowing, gradual changes or seismic ones, can determine the nature and the force of the temporality at work in narrative. Apart from expanding and systematizing knowledge about narrative, apart from enlarging the set of implements available to narratological criticism, and perhaps functioning as a rhetoric by suggesting hitherto relatively unexploited narrative possibilities, apart from performing all of these jobs, the revisiting of narrative traits, classes, and schemes relates to a third crucial narratological task, not the characterization of constituents used to generate narratives, but the elucidation of what it takes to process the latter, not the establishment of what we know about narratives and their functioning, but the specification of what it means to understand them. It need hardly be said that such understanding is difficult and perhaps impossible to define. Even an operational definition like understanding a narrative is being able to answer correctly relevant questions about its meaning may ultimately well be inadequate and in any case raises further definitional problems. For instance, it raises problems about what relevance means, what a correct answer is. I have a long passage that's a little bit technical that I'm going to skip here, but one should remember that these are difficult questions to answer. That said, I believe that understanding a narrative, even superficially, does involve the ability to answer questions regarding what happened in the world represented, to whom or to what, where, when, how, and why, the the narrative without contradicting the answers to these questions and the ability to paraphrase. The nature of that third naratological task, the task pertaining to comprehension, partly explains perhaps the rise of cognitive narratology and such related enterprises as the natural narratology promoted by Monica Frudening, the rhetorical narratology prolonging the work of Wayne Booth, or the psychonarratology that we talked a bit about yesterday, advocated by Marisa Bortolucci and Peter Dixon. That is, it explains the rise of narratologies interested in the interaction between texts and processes in the various contexts, psychological, cultural, historical, that processes bring to bear on the processing activity, in the frames, the scripts, the schemata, the preference rules, the pragmatic norms or semiotic principles that they rely upon to construct or reconstruct the narratives they aim to understand. Even if one can answer a question like, what happens to Little Red Riding Hood at the end of the tale, without taking into account the concerns and anxieties provoked by her adventure, there is no doubt that empathy for a particular character or curiosity about a particular undertaking concentrates attention on certain parts of the text rather than others. Those students of narrative, East and West, from India or from ancient Greece, recognized long ago the significance of links between narrative and emotion, and though more recently theorists have made narratological room for emotion, one must admit that the latter has been relatively neglected in narrative studies, and that an effective narratology should be further developed as part of or along with a cognitive narratology. Along with this elaboration, the question of narrative understanding invites the elaboration of a neuro-narratology, or rather a bio-narratology, which, in addition to exploring biological correlates of emotions, their arousal, their fluctuations, their valences, would map brain regions, say, to particular sets of narrative features or their interaction, and would explore narrative disorders like the inability to order experiences in story form or to consider virtualities in the unfolding of sequences of events. There is a fourth important narratological task which relates to cognition, emotion, or more generally biology, and which consists in examining not so much the what or the how of narrative, but rather something like the why. As Roland Barthes pointed out almost 50 years ago, there are innumerable kinds of narrative informing a tremendous variety of modes: myth, legend, literature, history, but also news or everyday conversation, and expressed through a variety of media from oral, written, and sign language to still and moving pictures, or to some combination of these different substances. Furthermore, I quote, "Under these indefinitely many forms, narrative is present at all times, in all places, in all societies. Indeed, narrative starts with the very history of mankind. There's never been anywhere, any people without narrative. All classes, all human groups have their stories, and very often those stories are enjoyed by people of very different and even opposite backgrounds. Narrative doesn't worry about good and bad literature. Like life itself, narrative is there, international, transhistorical, transcultural. The universality of narrative can be connected to the multiplicity and significance of its functions, representing what happened and exploring what may happen, say, ordering experiences, offering examples or making points, shedding light on individual fate or group destiny, on the nature of a person or a collectivity, deciphering the meaning of time and giving time a meaning, not to mention inducing catharsis or providing pleasure. The so-called cognitive turn of the past few decades has led to an emphasis on the examination of narrative as a sense-making device, a problem-solving instrument, a fundamental mode of human cognition, and it can be accompanied by a consideration of the way narrative and its diversification fit within evolutionary theory, the type of survival advantage that they confer, the aspects of evolutionary fitness that they represent, the kinds of adaptive traits that they constitute, the links with evolutionary features, mechanisms, and processes that they have. Obviously, there are numerous other narratological tasks and narratological questions that are more or less related to the one I've discussed. What, for example, as I already mentioned before, is the evolutionary history of narrative, or more modestly, the evolutionary history of this form or that feature of narrative? What stages do we go through in developing narrative competence, the ability to produce and process narratives? Why are some types of narrative used more frequently than others? Why are some used more frequently at some times or in some places? And so on and so forth. Now, most, if not all of the tasks I mentioned involve empirical problems, requiring empirically based solutions, and whether narratologists adopt classical or post-classical positions, they should attempt to ground their discipline through empirical or experimental, cross-cultural and cross-media study. Theory should agree with reality, the map should correspond with the territory, the model should conform to the model, and an adequate model of narrative, characterizing narrative competence, should be realistic, that is, empirically justified, as well as explicit and complete. After a number of intoxicating proposals from Todorov, Remas, Van Dyck, and mountains giving birth to molehills, the modeling impulse seems to have abated. But, as I said yesterday, it seems clear to me that the construction of such a model, whatever form it takes, is crucial to the coherence of the discipline and the systematic exploration of the specificity of narrative, that is, of a singularly human object. Now it's time for questions, comments, whatever, and answers.
post-classical?
In general.
In general.
The French accent has been disappearing, though I skipped a passage because I didn't want to go on and on and on. There are several French or Francophone people who have done and are doing narratologically significant work. Alain Abatel, Sylvie Patron, who wrote a very interesting book called Le Narrateur, the Narrator, where she defends a certain thesis put forth by Käthe Hamburger over half a century ago in Theologie der Dichtung, the logic of narrative. Raphaël Baroni, who's in Switzerland, Françoise Revard, who's in Switzerland, Vincent Jouve, and of course Jean-Marie Schaeffer, who wrote a very fun book entitled Pourquoi la fiction, why fiction? So the accent is disappearing because frankly narratology was to a large extent a French or Francophone invention. There was narratological work well before 1966, but narratology is born as such with number 8 of Communication in 1966, and the name, the word narratology, is created in 1969 by Tsvetan Todorov. So it was a very francophonic kind of accent, and now it is less francophonic, and where you have a lot of important narratological work is in Germany, where we have even centers of narratology, in Hamburg, for example, in Tübingen, and so on and so forth. In Germany, for sure, in the United States, in Israel, etc. Today, though there are some old classical narratologists, and I consider myself one of them, even though post-colonial narratology is post-classical. But though there are classical narratologists, and that is, though there are people who are particularly interested in the form of the content and the form of the expression in narrative, most work I know must be characterized as post-classical narratology, and among the well-known post-classical narratologists, I'll give names of people working in the US, because those are the people I know best. There's David Herman, who coined the term post-classical narratology. There's James Phelan, who is the editor of the journal Narrative and does rhetorical narratology, continues the great American critic Wayne Booth, who wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Fiction. There's Monica Frudernick in Germany, but she's well known in the US too, who does what she calls natural narratology. That is, she stresses the fact, she studies very much the structures that one can find in everyday, spontaneous, non-deliberate narratives that we tell one another to report this or that, to express an experience, and so on and so forth. And unnatural narratology with Brian Richardson. It's a narratology that focuses on weird narratives, and it reminds us, and this is something important, I will make a little point here of methodology. I think on the one hand, it is very good to trust one's intuitions about narratives, to invent for oneself little narratives and to study them and to see whether they say something or not. A little bit like the linguist, the modern linguist, a modern linguist who speaks English has intuitions about what is a sentence of English and what is not. Knows intuitively that the man went to school is a sentence of English, and knows intuitively that the man the school went into is Tarzan, but it's not English. The same way we, since we all can tell little stories, all can produce little narratives, we have intuitions about stories, about narratives and so on. And we should trust them. But we should always also look at actual corpora of narratives, at extant narrative, to see what other people have thought, what other people have created, what other people have. We can think of many examples, but we cannot think of every example. We can think of many forms, even weird forms, but we cannot think of every weird forms. So someone like Brian Richardson and his unnatural narratology is a narratologist who focuses on weird narratives that various writers have imagined and created, and studies what in them is weird, and why is it weird, and should it be weird, etc., etc., etc. And finally, there is so-called cognitive narratology, which tries to align the endeavors of narratology with the endeavors of the cognitive sciences, that is, the conjunction of linguistics, philosophy, psychology, and artificial intelligence.
Čia buvo paminėta kognityvinė naratologija. Sakykite, ar čia kažkaip siejasi su terapiniais tais metodais, kaip naratyvinė terapija? Ar čia siejasi? Kažką daugiau galima, nes Lietuvoje populiarėja dabar, bet dar neturim tokių terapijų.
No, but it should be. It should be, because I think I mentioned it very briefly today as I was talking, because one should be interested not only in the kinds of cognitive resources that we put to work in order to produce or to process narratives, not only in narrative as a kind of cognitive form that allows us to grasp certain situations or understand certain human beings or understand ourselves, our nature, our past, etc., etc. I think we should also be interested in narrative disorders. In narrative disorders, that is, we should study people who may be impaired in the same way as they might be impaired linguistically, and you know, of course, with Alzheimer's, that aphasia occurs and people forget most plain of words, etc., 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 are incapable of producing certain syntactic forms, are incapable of remembering certain words, etc., etc. The same way with narrative. There are people, not many, thankfully, there are people who are not capable of ordering events chronologically. There are people who are not able to adopt different points of view in telling a story. Indeed, I believe that schizophrenia has as a symptom the inability to model a possible narrative, a possible interlocutor when the schizophrenic tells a story. Okay. So I think we should study this, and in that way it can be part of therapy. But narratology, classical narratology, is not a therapeutic. Post-classical, perhaps, because it can be therapeutic to tell one story. It can be therapeutic to read certain stories. It can be therapeutic in the same way that it is therapeutic to model things with one's hand, or to compose little pieces of music, or to learn how to compose it, or to draw little figures or representations of human beings, and so on and so forth. So I think narrative can be therapeutic, and I'm sure there must be some post-classical narratologist somewhere who is developing narratology as therapy. I think there have been a couple of books written entitled probably postmodern narratology, but I think that postmodern narratology is part of what is often characterized as unnatural narratology, because many postmodern works are, in quotes, unnatural. That is, they do not quite resemble the little narratives that we tell each other, the little spontaneous narratives that we tell. They are slightly weird, they are slightly bizarre, they are slightly unnatural. So, postmodern narratology, if there is one, is part of unnatural narratology. One thing is that it's good for is that it examines narratives that are not traditional, and many of the categories of narratology are based on traditional narratives, or on our experience of telling stories and processing them, or on the great classical novelists that we've all read. But that is not enough to think of all the possibilities of narratives, and therefore it is good to look at postmodern works. I mentioned a few in passing. I mentioned, for instance, Georges Perec, who writes an entire novel called The Things, which is not a novel telling you about what happened somewhere, but is a novel telling you about what would have happened if someone had done this or that. And it is told in the conditional sense. I mentioned a biography by Jean-Michel Reynaud which is a biography written in the subjunctive mode. May he be born on such and such a day. May he, and so on and so forth. And I mentioned the Laurie Moore self-directed narrative made of imperatives to herself, if you will, or to the narrator telling the story. It's a story that proceeds purely by imperative verbs. So when we read these postmodern works, when we read these unnatural narratives, we think, wait, we should perhaps modify a little bit this or that category to take into account these strange things. We should not think that everyone tells a story more or less in the same way. We should acknowledge that there are all sorts of weird narratives, and narratology must take them into account. At the same time, I think all narratological categories, all of them that have been developed so far, apply well to postmodern narratives. That is, you can talk about things like speed, like frequency, like point of view, like distance, about any narrative, whether it's modern, pre-modern, postmodern, or what have you. Thank you. Ačiū.
Jeigu aš galėčiau palyginti naratologiją su religija, žinau, man už tai turbūt nuims galvą šitokia erezija, bet tai jos centre yra popiežius vardu Geraldas Prince'as. Ačiū jums labai tikrai. Man atrodo, jūs mus užkrėtė tam tikrą ambiciją kurti modelius, tam tikrus ir kurti naratologijos katalogą.
Džiaugiamės jūsų apsilankymu ir mes profesoriui padovanojome aktą literatija komparatyvą naujausią numerį Europos kraštovaizdžio transformacijos. Tai tikimės, kad tie mažieji pasakojimai susijungs į didesnį pasakojimą ir tad dovanojame taip pat pasakojimą, Lietuvos pasakojimą. Tai yra mūsų universiteto parengta elektroninė knyga apie Lietuvą. Nežinau, kad tikrai profesorių žavėsi ir mūsų šalimi, ir mūsų miestu, ir dar jo kelionė rytoj laukia kažkur kažką pamatyti. Tai tikrai ačiū Jums už išskirtinės paskaitas ir linkime nepamiršti ir Lietuvos istorijos.
And for giving me what must be some sort of post-classical work on I will cherish it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ačiū visiems, kurie lankė mano paskaitas, ačiū dekanai, ačiū prodekanui, ačiū universitetui ir ačiū už jau turbūt reikia vadinti postklasikinę dovaną.